Most professional wrestling matches are assembled using 3-act structure, just like most conventional films are. But the match between Io Shirai and Candice LeRae dispenses with this narrative skeleton, just like the 2019 Academy Award winner for Best Picture does. And I'm going to break all of that down for you next. I'm Mike Quackenbush. This is Till We Make It. And I have been fortunate throughout my career to work in front of the cameras as a pro wrestler, referee, ring announcer, and commentator. And I've worked behind the scenes too as a promoter, booker, agent, coach, and consultant. And if you are as passionate about professional wrestling as I am, make sure to subscribe down below and enable those notifications so you never miss out on a video. Today, I want to examine the symmetry between Bong Joon-ho's black comedy thriller film Parasite and a recent match between Io Shirai and Candice LeRae. And so you are adequately forewarned, my friend, spoilers are dead ahead. You probably know pro wrestling tends to favor 3-act structure, roughly the way it was outlined thousands of years ago by Aristotle in his work Poetics. And this form is codified into a template during the 1970s as Sid Field pens his book Screenplay. In its simplest form, it puts aside 1 act for setup, a 2nd act for confrontation, and a 3rd act for resolution. The majority of conventional films like Paddington, Paddington 2, and Pacific Rim adhere to this template pretty strictly. And so to keep the alliteration going, I just thought I'll pick another movie that starts with the letter P, and I'll be golden. And then along came Parasite to mess up my pattern. I watched Parasite end to end 3 times over, looking for structural signposts as I went. And it dawned on me, this is not assembled with 3-act structure as its narrative backbone. And I don't think Parasite is a conventional film by any standard. Sometimes we hear 3-act structure referred to by the shorthand of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even Aristotle used that shorthand. But in pro wrestling, we think of the 1st act as the shine, the open, or the promise, the 2nd act as the heat, the steam, or the rising tension, and the 3rd act as the comeback, climax, or finish. Although Parasite has a beginning, a middle, and an end, they are not formatted like the 3 acts we see outlined in Poetics, or the 3 acts that we expect from professional wrestling. I believe Parasite is 2 acts conjoined by a transition, and I happen to think the match between Io Shirai and Candice LeRae is exactly the same. The 2 acts of Parasite each have different characteristics, and each evinces a distinct flavor. The opening act is a black comedy, most of all. I certainly think that this scene is, and so is this, and so too is this scene. I think that this part of the film is defined by the conflict between the Park family and the Kim family, the haves against the have-nots, and it ends right around the 50-minute mark, once the Kims have completely infiltrated the Park's home. At the point in the movie that Chung-suk gets hired as their new housekeeper, the Kims have effectively won, and the conflict is over. They have made the Park's home into their own, and then a transition begins which delivers us into the final act. This part of the film is defined by the conflict between the Kim family and the former housekeeper and her husband, and this has a distinctly different flavor. It begins transforming into something else, starting here. This, the director himself says, is the real start of the film. When the former housekeeper shows up unannounced, needing access to the basement, it begins to shift into its final act. And when Chung-suk opens the door to her, she opens the door into the thriller movie Parasite becomes. The final act is a thriller, most of all. I think Io Shirai versus Candice LeRae from NXT TakeOver Toronto is also 2 acts, and each has a distinct flavor. Generally speaking, we think of Act 1 of a pro wrestling match as being the shine, the period of time when we set up crucial characteristics and shine out key values to the audience. But this match dispenses with that entirely and presents a two-act structure using only the heat and the climax, what we would generally think of as Acts 2 and 3 of a pro wrestling match. In part, this is enabled by the 3-minute video package that precedes the match itself. It does a lot of that setup work. So if 3 minutes of the match time was then also dedicated to setup work, they would have been wasted minutes. The work is already done. Instead, what we get is a heat that burns for the opening 5 minutes of the match, and it's seasoned with physical WWE tropes. Like this, and like this, and like this. In the heat, Candice is almost exclusively reactionary. She isn't proactive. She only reacts to what Io does. Until we arrive at this transition, when Candice shifts into offense, and this delivers us into the second and final act of the match. Similar to how Parasite leaves behind its black comedy tropes and leans into being a thriller movie, so too does this match leave behind the physical WWE tropes, and it leans into Joshi. This feels like a Joshi match to me, and so does this, and so too does this. By the way, if this kind of content is right up your alley and you want to supercharge your pro wrestling career, then consider joining my community over on Patreon. There you can get access to things like my essays, podcasts, book excerpts, seminars, and unreleased material you won't find anywhere else. A link to it is down below, and we would love to have you. I happen to think that Parasite and the Toronto match both benefit from flavoring their two acts very differently. Even though both tell an engaging story from end to end, that shift into different tropes propels us through the final act with a feeling that what we're watching has just reinvented itself. Parasite becomes a thriller movie, and Shirai versus LeRae becomes a Joshi match. Each of these examples benefits from dispensing with the expected structure. Parasite is not assembled in a conventional way, and yet that does not impede its ability to draw us into the narrative. And the TakeOver Toronto match is not assembled in the usual wrestling fashion, and yet that does not impede its ability to draw us into the action or to follow the emotional gear changes that the characters experience. The match between Io and Candice from TakeOver Toronto stands out from the rest of the NXT offerings that night because it takes on an atypical structure. And Parasite stands out from the rest of the best films of 2019, like Joker, 1917, and Ford v Ferrari, because it takes on an unconventional shape. The fact that it deviates from expected norms makes both memorable, even interesting case studies for us to discuss, but I don't think that's what makes either of them great. Great movies and great matches result not only from their underlying architecture, but also from the brilliant execution of bold visions overflowing with surprising twists and turns. Unloading a Joshi-style barnburner on an NXT crowd is as startling a revelation as discovering someone's been living in the basement all along. Because Io Shirai versus Candice LeRae starts in the heat, there is no shine for us to dissect, but an exploration of exactly that can be found in this edition of Movies Are Matches. So to learn more about that, click on the video right now. And if you need more information on the performance and structure of pro wrestling matches, check out my latest book, Toolbox: Building Better Pro Wrestling, can be found on Amazon at the link down below.